Although I don't want to make any really definitive judgments since the territory is so uncharted. Now we're going to look at what happens if white plays positionally by fianchettoing his king's bishop with g3. It's most flexible to play it at once, leaving open the option of whether to play c4 or just to play knight c3, leaving the c-pawn at home on c2. In these lines, the play is similar to the Leningrad Dutch, only with c5 and d5 thrown in. As in that recently popular opening, black gets a weakness on e6, but the big question is, can white exploit it? After a few typical moves, for example, knight f6, bishop g2, d6, knight c3, g6, knight f3, bishop g7. We see what we mean about this weakness on e6. It's right in the middle of the black camp and rather out of reach of most of white's pieces. Generally, black can comfortably keep white out, but if things do go wrong and a white knight ends up on e6, it could be curtains. In a way, it's gambling a lot with very good odds of gaining a little. Normally, you'll just get quite an active game and e6 will prove completely irrelevant. But sometimes you'll just lose out of hand. However, provided black is careful, the chances of disaster should be very, very small. Before we look at a couple of my games in this line, I just want to discuss some general ideas in the position, in particular, which squares the pieces should be aiming for. Black nearly always fianchettos his king's bishop and castles kingside. His knight on the king side on f6 usually just stays there for quite a while. His queen can go to e8 maybe, from where it can support b5. Or also possibly later black can play h6, g5, and attack on the king side with queen g6 or queen h5. A more difficult question is where to put the queen's knight. In fact, this depends on where white puts his king's knight. Often in chess, one side's plans mutually interdepend on the other side's plans. White has two ways to develop his king's knight. He can either go simply to f3, or alternatively he could go to h3 and then to f4, from where he eyes the weakness on e6. Correspondingly, black can either develop knight a6 to c7, where he attacks the d-pawn, defends the square e6, and prepares the advance b5. And the alternative knight development for black is simply knight d7 to e5. In my opinion, if white develops knight f3, black is better off going knight a6 to c7. Partly this is because if the white knight is on f3, it prevents a black knight going to the e5 square. Also, the pawn on d5 is a little bit more of a target with the white bishop on g2 blocked by the knight on f3. Alternatively, if white develops his knight to h3 and f4, a black knight is much safer on the e5 square, so I think black should head knight d7 to e5, because white hasn't got the option of playing f2 to f4. Some care is needed with move order. Notice that after g3, d6, white could play knight h3 at once. And now, black should play knight d7 immediately, so as to meet knight f4 with knight e5. If, alternatively, black played, say, 4g6, white could play knight f4, and now black couldn't play knight d7 because it blocks the bishop on c8 and allows knight e6, and that's disaster for black. Normally, if anything white lands on the square e6, black simply wants to take it and then try and round up the pawn on e6 that results. What about white's plans in this position? I guess the main one is to break with e4. If white does play e4, black should never allow white to play e5 as well. He has to take on e4 first. Let me give you a few sample moves in this position. Bishop g2. knight f6, knight c3, g6. Now white plays e4. Here, white isn't threatening e5 yet, so black can simply develop bishop g7. Now, if white takes on f5, the general rule in the Clarendon court is never to take back with the g-pawn. This would be a horrible positional mistake. Bishop takes f5 is much better and leads to an active game. A lot of general comments, but it really is difficult to give precise moves when both sides' plans are so dependent upon each other. What I'm going to do now is show you two complete games, one where white played c4 and one where white just played knight c3. This in fact was the move chosen by candidate Grandmaster Keith Arkle in a game we played just yesterday, that is, the day before I recorded this video. I replied with knight f6, and white fianchettoed his bishop with g3. I played d6. White completed the fianchetto with bishop g2, and I fianchettoed my bishop with g6. White now played e4. This is a position we were looking at earlier, in fact. I replied bishop g7, and white chose to take on f5. E takes f5. Now, of course, I didn't break my general rule. I took back with the bishop. Bishop takes f5. White continued knight ge2. Now there is the familiar problem of where to put the queen's knight, whether to go to d7 or to a6. I chose a6 because if knight d7, then white could try h3, and if knight e5, white can push back all black's pieces with first g4, bishop d7, now f4, hitting the knight. Now white was a bit worried about the possibility of knight b4 hitting the sensitive c2 point, so he played the move a3 to prevent this, but this gives black a little bit more time to continue with his plan of knight c7, which is what I played. White castled, and now I had a decision to make, whether just to castle or to exploit the opportunity to play b5. In fact, that's what I did, b5. White replied b4. Now this move prevents black's further expansion on the queen side, and it also threatens to go b takes c5, d takes c5, d6, winning the exchange since the bishop on g2 hits the rook on a8, and the knight on c7 is attacked. However, I ignored this threat and simply castled. This was on the grounds that if white continues with bc5, dc5, d6, I could simply take on d6, e takes d6, and if bishop takes a8, queen takes a8, and on general grounds, the white squares around the king are so weak that black has good play for the exchange. If, for example, queen takes d6, black could play knight f e8, and after, say, queen takes c5, black plays bishop h3, and white's in real trouble here. White wasn't tempted by all this excitement. He simply played rook b1. And now black captured on b4, white recaptured with the pawn, and I played queen d7. Looking at this position, both sides have serious weaknesses. White can try and get in on c6 or e6, for example after knight d4, and black has chances of getting in on the c-file, with the weakened squares c2, c3 and c4. I think it's probably about level, which is something of a success for black. The game continued, knight f4, rook a c8, rook e1, and now I expanded on the king side with g5. White retreated, knight f e2, and I defended my g5 pawn with h6. White now tried knight d4. We've got a critical position here. It's necessary to calculate quite carefully here. I played bishop h3, but after knight c6, my pawn on e7 is under attack. It looks as though black's in trouble here, but in fact the position is very deceptive. After the game, my opponent Keith Arkle said that after knight c6 he had reached his dream position, only to discover that he's losing. I played rook c e8, and the point is that after, say, rook takes e7, rook takes e7, knight takes e7 check, black has the slightly surprising move king f7. Instead of king f7, if black played queen takes e7, white would simply play bishop takes h3 and be a pawn up. Here, the knight on e7 is very short of squares. It has to go back to c6, and then black captures on g2, white recaptures, and black plays knight c takes d5. This threatens knight takes c3, and if white plays knight c3 takes d5, black captures on c6, and the pin on the long white diagonal is decisive. After a long think, Keith realised that his dream position was actually something of a nightmare. He came up with bishop h1, but now black played knight g4. This attacks f2 with the knight, and also uncovers an attack by the bishop on g7 on the knight on c3. White continued knight e4, defending against both threats, but now black created a third threat, rook f5, and this attacks the d5 pawn, and white cannot defend it. Black is just winning now, but Keith played on resourcefully. Knight d4, rook takes d5, c3, defending the knight on d4, and now I couldn't resist the move e5. Actually, it is a good move. White now played a surprising move, knight takes g5. I recaptured on g5, h takes g5. White played bishop h1 takes d5. I played knight takes d5, and white now played knight f3. And we see that black has two pieces against a rook, but looking at that beautiful bishop on h3 and the exposed white king on g1, it looks like black has a terrific attack. I played the move queen f7, which stops knight takes g5 because of queen takes f2 with mate to follow. It also threatens knight takes c3. White now found the only move to keep the game going. He played rook b2. And now if I play knight takes c3, white could play queen b3, pinning the queen on f7 to the king on g8. White is now threatening knight takes g5, and black's pieces are very uncomfortable here. The bishop on h3, the queen on f7, and if the queen moves, the knight on d5 is very vulnerable. I defended against these problems with bishop h6. White continued knight takes g5. Anyway, I captured on g5, and white captured back on g5. And now came the critical moment of the game. I made a serious mistake. I played rook e8 to c8. What I should have played was rook f8. Then I would have had a one game. I was in quite bad time trouble. After rook c8, white was able to play f3, which really confuses the issue. After a bit of a panic, I played knight takes c3, and with just a minute left on my clock, I offered a draw. Keith, with just over 2 minutes on his clock, decided to accept it. The position's just a complete mess now. I consider that quite an interesting game. It was especially instructive the way, after knight c6, nearly all the spectators thought white was just winning, but in fact, white's in serious trouble in that position, as we showed earlier. Many white players prefer to play these positional lines with the move c4 thrown in before developing the knight on b1. My game against B. Marshall, earlier this year, 1995 that is, continued knight f3, knight f6, and now white played c4. I played g6, white continued g3, white played d6, white completed his fianchetto with bishop g2, black did likewise with bishop g7, and now both sides castled. White castled, black castled. Finally white developed his knight, knight c3, and I decided to go on the a6 to c7 route, knight a6. White played a3, possibly unnecessary. I continued knight c7, Now white broke with e4. This threatens the positionally crushing e5, so I had to stop at that with f takes e4. White continued knight g5,